And now I'd like to turn it over to our presenters for today, Ed Jacobs and Andrea Darr, who will be running this Ask an Expert office hour session on Handle with Care.
Thank you, Cody. Let me see if I can get my screen up here, share the sound, and I think we're good to go. Okay. So I hope you can see what we have for you here, and I'm just going to say that. So again, my name is Ed Jacobs, and I have the privilege and honor of presenting today with Ms. Andrea Darr, who she'll tell you a little bit about our background, but we've figured out we've known each other now for about 13 years. It seems like we met just about a year ago. And Andrea is, of course, Miss Handle with Care, and has brought it to probably all 50 states, and I don't know how many international areas. But again, what I'm going to try to do on my piece is show you the way that we try to present it, both locally and in other states that we've done. So I've probably done hundreds of these, and I don't know how many folks, 18, 19, 20,000 over the last, say, 5 or 6 or 10 years. And I'm sure Andrea's done just as many. So I'm just going to use some slides that I think have worked for us. And then I think they may be somewhat, I tried to pick some that would be applicable for what you all may have in your local community. So again, we will talk about Handle with Care. We're going to talk about ACEs. We're going to talk about childhood trauma. But what I'm trying to take that point of view is, if you were to present to your community, what would it look like? What strategies might you use, and all those kinds of things. So let me go to the next slide if I can. And you see a title of a book here. This is a book that when I went to the district attorney's office, I've been spending time in juvenile probation and working in detention centers for about 20 years. I went to the DA's office, and I was really trying to look for a focus. My job was the director of prevention and working in grants, et cetera. And I was really trying to focus. And I came across this book by a woman named Betsy McAllister Groves. She works at Boston Medical Center. She was the head of social work there. And she wrote this book about her experience in the emergency room. Now, this is also kids who have been experienced through domestic violence, community violence, and certainly the community violence that we had. And I think a number of communities from 85 to 95 had a real uptick in, due to crack epidemic, a real uptick in violence. So there's a lot of kids witnessing that. For me personally, after I had read the book, I was just thinking about how can we implement, like, what can we do in our community? How would we possibly go about it? And is there a need for it, or a sense of urgency? So quickly, we had a story where a gentleman who was a school adjustment counselor called me on a Tuesday, told me about an armed home invasion, which had happened on a Thursday, a drug house ripoff. One set of drug dealers broke into the house of what they thought was another set of drug dealers, except it was a single mom with 3 kids, 12, 5, and 6. The mother was pistol whipped. The 12-year-old boy tried to protect her. He had a gun put in his mouth. The 5 and 6-year-old were in the back room crying. And by the time they realized they were in the wrong place, the police were on their way there. Police came, took pictures of everything, took everybody to the emergency room. They come back at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's now Friday morning. Mother tries to duct tape the door. It's just really a nightmare. And this gentleman who had called me and talked to me about this, the school adjustment counselor, said, Ed, the next day, that Friday, those kids came to school, and they came on time. And and he said, I remember, because we had the 12-year-old holding hands with the 5 and 6, and I said good morning to them, and they said good morning to me, but we didn't know anything that had happened the night before. So I started to think about it, and I'd ask you to do the same. What happens if you were that child, the 5 or 6 or the 12, and this had happened to you, which is probably the most traumatic or noteworthy thing in your life so far at that point, and no one of the adults said a word to you? I always thought the adults in my world at that age kind of spoke to each other somehow and knew what was going on. And so I began to think that was going to be a way that kids were going to start to engage the school and say, well, if they don't care, then I don't care, or maybe this is my new reality, or anything which I thought would not be engaging, but more building a toxic relationship. I also then said to Ed at one point, listen, that's horrible. I mean, we got to start to think about this. He said, it got worse. I said, how did it get worse? He said, well, it was a Friday, and one of the boys, the 12-year-old, had told a friend of his that what had happened the night before, that he had a gun in his mouth, put in his mouth. And what happened was, by the time the rumor got down to the main office, he has a gun in his locker, and we had to shelter in place, and we stopped all the buses and everything, and we had to go through his locker. And of course, we found out the exact opposite and found out the real story. And his question to me was, as a mentor of mine, can't we do any better than this? And I thought he was right on target. So I went back to look at the Betsy McAllister stuff. She had been doing some work with OJJDP and Safe Start, which I thought was really, and Andrea may touch upon that. And then, we were from Massachusetts, so Yale, New Haven's about 4 hours away, 3 hours away. And about 27 years ago, I think Steve Merrins from Yale Medical School, as well as New Haven Police, formed a partnership, and they started doing ride-alongs. And so we mimicked that for 15 years in our county, and where we had social workers riding with police officers and going to hot spots or following up on something that happened the night before. But we still weren't making the connection with the school. The other two books there I put are just two favorites of mine. And I also want to tell you that I have a long bibliography list of both books and videos and articles that may be helpful to you. By no means exhaustive. And if you want to add to it, that'd be great too. So let me see if we go to the next one. So this is, we needed the next piece of the puzzle, in my opinion. We had police were kind of telling us what was going on. We didn't know what to do with the information. We talked to the schools. The schools would say to us, gee, you have to talk to Mrs. Smith and Mr. Smith, because they're our trauma experts. They went to the program. They do all that work. And then I realized they had 900 kids in the school. And when you looked at the numbers, it just didn't add up. What I liked about the Trauma and Learning, Helping Traumatized Children Learn, the book from Mass Advocates for Children, which is part of what's called the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative out of Harvard Law. I know that's a mouthful, I apologize. But these people really talked about a whole school approach, which made all the sense in the world to me. From the superintendent on down to whoever, paraprofessionals, school, substitute teachers, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, janitors, you name it. There needed to be an understanding of what some of the kids were going through. So this really became what I would call the third leg of the stool. And from this book was a concept in there called the red envelope, which then is going to evolve, and Andrea will talk about that, into Handle with Care. I like data because I think it helps people. If I can, and you'll forgive my expression, but if I can hit people over the head with the data or that story about that little boy, which I may tell a little more intently, I'm trying to get people's attention to understand that what kids are going through in their community. So, for instance, here's one we took 2 years worth of kids who were in police reports in a city of 100,000 in Massachusetts, Brockton, and we started to take a look at training the police officer to look for kids. And here are some of the numbers. So, again, when you think about child development, brain development, look what's happening, look at the trauma, et cetera, in terms of brain development. We'll speak more about that. And again, they were doing 1,500 to 1,600 a year. That's about 27 a week. About 37 a week approximately. And most of those involve children when you ask the officers. And then you'd say, well, what actually happened with that? And some of them were what we would call Massachusetts 51A, or mandated reporter. But many of them weren't. Maybe the children weren't home. Well, the children weren't home, so maybe it's not a mandated report. So data, I'm just trying to hit people with it to get people. I'm married to an educator, and they're wonderful people. They're curious, but I think sometimes, they get in the world of I work at my job and here's what I do, and I don't necessarily know what's happening. So again, I'm still trying to build the case. We looked at all our domestic violence cases of those 1,600 and what time of day did they happen. And for this, it happened, you can see 4 p.m. to midnight, and that's, almost 50%. And that's, who else is at home during that period of time? Well, I would think kids. I'm not going to play this, but I like this tape. It's very, very hard. I've heard it, I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds of times. It's very hard to listen to. It was originally a training call, a real call, but a training used in the domestic violence community for years. It's on Lisa. It took place in San Diego, I believe, in 1990. I want to say 1990 or 2000. I think it's 90. And it's a 7-minute version or a 10-minute version of this young girl who's very polite. It's probably parentified child, I would assume. Very much sounds like it to me. She is trying to engage the police to come. Her mother's boyfriend or new husband or something is drunk, and he's not being very good to the kids or the baby, etc. So it's a very difficult video or to listen to or read because there's a transcript. The reason I do it is I'm really, again, trying to get people's attention. Now, when I've done it, I have to talk to people about it. Might be a trigger because it certainly could be. And in some places where I've done large auditoriums, I'll ask people who are working with us as part of the presenters to be outside the doors and tell people if they need to get up, it's understandable. I can understand it. And again, we're not trying to do it to shock them, but we are trying to do it to get people's attention to understand. And I think for that reason, it's been effective. Now, I'm going to give you a series of 3 or 4 maps, but let me just say this: from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock, that's Main Street in a city, in a city of 100,000, city of Brockton. I've done this in a number of cities where we've done some trainings for this. And again, this is where what you see here, as you can, if you can make it out, is the blue. You see blue with a little flag on it. Those are schools. And then here is just 8 or 9 months of 8 or 9 months, excuse me, of shots fired. And so this, you can see where the schools are. And here's narcotics. There's firearms. I'm sorry, the other one was narcotics. This is a heat map of gun incidences. So you can see, if you can, I hope, that 12 to 6, that scatter. And you can see some detailed areas a little bit more as well. And again, here's one of another shots fired. And this was also after they put in what's called a shot spotter. And you might know about that triangulation. But you can see that it's a pretty, there's a lot of workload. There's a lot of firearms in this community, and there's a lot of schools. And so every time I show these slides, almost guarantee whether this community or somebody else, people come up to me, usually teachers, social workers, and say, I come to work every day at 8 o'clock. I leave every afternoon at 4:30. I knew this was a tough neighborhood, but I didn't know all this was going on. Now, you could also use this. If you didn't have this, you could also overlay domestic violence calls for service. You could certainly do community violence or gang-related violence. You could also do school lunch program. There's a lot of things you can do to get raise people's attention about the needs of children in their community. This is the last one I show, and what this one shows is the number of kids who have been before the court in juvenile court within the last 4 years, and it tells whether they've been there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. But I hope you can see that when you start to see the scatter, that 12 to 6, that what we start to see is these are where these kids live. And so what we're trying to do with folks when we do these kinds of things is get that aha moment. Now, let me just say one more thing about community ACEs and then looking for community ACEs. So what's that mean? Well, we'll talk a little bit more about ACEs, but things like domestic violence calls where children are present, again, child abuse cases, certainly the number of cases, what we call care and protections in Massachusetts, but maybe termination of parental rights, et cetera. Talking to the emergency rooms, talking to the DA's office, talking to the police, getting any kind of data you can get as it relates to any of the things, homelessness. Those of you who are familiar with schools, McKinney-Vento, in terms of the federal statute regards to homelessness, really all that data is just to make the case. And what we're trying to do is really create a sense of urgency. So we were starting to do that. And then about 2000, we started that in about 2005. And then we met Andrea, and then we're going to make that shift to handle with care. But one of the things that was really clear to us by 2012, 13, 14, and by 14 really embedded was the opioid epidemic in Plymouth County. So this is state of Massachusetts, and you can see that hockey stick is going right up. I think now it's almost 30 per 100,000 deaths. We had over 2,500 in Massachusetts, nationally. I think it's something 111,000. That's our part of Massachusetts. Pretty, again, a lot of water, et cetera. But, so there's a lot coming into our shores. But again, we were catching a lot of those, and similar to the numbers you would have in parts of Southern Ohio and West Virginia and some other folks. So we were really, really struggling. And again, you can see that we made a huge jump in terms of unattended deaths. So again, we like the data because we're trying to get people to understand there's a sense of urgency with this. Again, a heat map on the right side there, that little kind of right in the middle, that's Plymouth, and Plymouth Rock is right there. And if you ever come to visit us, you make sure you call me, but we're, that's our community. The upper left-hand corner, that's the urban area of Brockton. Interesting that Plymouth County will have about 2,500 unattended opioid overdoses, not deaths. They have about 150 thereabouts. But of the people who live in Brockton, of the people who overdosed in Brockton, over half, about 51%, were not from that city. So there was a lot of that transient stuff. And we can talk about the QRT, the quick response teams at another point. But I think that's an important part of this in terms of looking to engage children who have been affected by opioids. We took a look at 1 year of deaths, and a lot of people thought before we pulled the numbers, well, it'd be a Burger King parking lot or a Dunkin' Donuts bathroom or something. And as you can see, 65% of our deaths happen in the home. And again, our question is, who else lives in homes? Again, we looked at the age range. When I first got my training at a place called McLean Hospital in Massachusetts, I worked on the addiction substance disorder unit, and many of the people who were dying of opioids were in their 40s and early 50s, sometimes 30s, but mainly that late 30s, 40s. The body's starting to wear out. But as you know, with the introduction of prescription medication starting people on a much, much younger age, maybe due to illness, maybe due to injury, et cetera, or maybe just, the proliferation of it and the diversion of those. And then, of course, by fentanyl coming in, that the vast majority of folks who are overdosing, at least in our area, about 68% are between the ages of 20 and 39. Frankly, I would call that prime time parent time. So again, that other way to make the example of what's happening to our kids. This is, unfortunately, we were doing some work in this area, and I had a state trooper who came to my office, said, we just finished this case. I heard what you were doing. I gave you he's got some pictures, and I said, did you stage any of this? He said, no. And I think you can see there's crayons there, and there's a toy there, and there's spoons, and there's needles, etc. This, unfortunately, was mother and father. Baby was born neonatal abstinence syndrome, was in NICU for about 3 months. The state took custody of her, gave her to temporary custody to the grandmother. The parents talked their way back into the grandmother's apartment. And I don't know this personally, but from NAS, from people I talk to with NAS babies, they can be cranky and temperamental, or maybe colicky of sorts, I guess. And in this case, the parents decided that maybe the baby needed just a little bit of titch of heroin to settle her down. And of course, she aspired, and they were prosecuted. And this is just probably the ultimate example of a drug endangered child. I don't like to use that word. I prefer drug exposed, but I really do. This is the ultimate example. So I apologize for showing you that. But again, just to give you an idea of some of the things we're trying to get people to become more and more aware. I went to a school and I said to them, hey, we got some really smart people, these agencies. I was running grants, and I said, we can pay for them to come and do training for you. And I was in a school that had 600 kids, 700 kids, K through 5. And I said, they can come and talk to you at school or your kids or whatever about drugs, et cetera, et cetera. And the principal said to me, that's great, but our kids are K through 5, they don't do drugs. And I will say that I went back to my office, and the staff we were kind of kicking around ideas, and we'd kind of come up with this slogan before, but they did a beautiful job of putting it together. Originally, it was 5-year-old Johnny has a drug problem, but 5-year-old Johnny doesn't do drugs. It was about 2 months later, to be honest with you, ironically enough, that the principal called me and asked me if we'd come in and do the training. And oh, by the way, how can we get Narcan to our nurse? Because one of the parents who was in line waiting to pick up their kids had nodded off and overdosed. And again, here's another example of stuff that we had kids put together. So this is what we called photo voice, and be happy to share any of this with you. And again, you can see that heroin is the worst thing that ever happened to me, and I've never touched it. So again, we're trying to get adults and other care providers to understand that, kids are affected by it. So again, awareness training. ACEs is not something I'm definitely going to go deep into because I think you probably have a really good understanding of that. But that video comes from Paper Tigers. That's the 5-minute Paper Tiger trailer. If you haven't seen that, really good. And again, I'm happy to send you a bibliography of what we have in terms of videos, etc. So again, as we go through this, you see what ACEs touched upon. And again, I could go into this deeper, obviously, but we're just trying to get people to become more aware of this. And when we do the training with teachers or police officers, we certainly go into a much more deeper discussion. I found that even up to 5 years ago, there was only 10% of the people knew what ACEs are. And now I feel like it's almost 50%. So again, we're just trying to keep moving this along and trying to talk to them about generational and historical trauma and how kids are affected by it, and maybe have a better understanding, maybe give that kid a break. And again, maybe some of you have seen, this is kind of one that I probably have seen myself a couple hundred times, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, doctor out of California. She's currently the Surgeon General, first ever in California, and has also written a book called The Deepest Well, which I highly recommend. And she is, she's something else. She gets this across in 16 minutes, and there's some real good parts in there for that I could recommend for your presentations to kind of impress upon your audience. Again, you're looking at brain, the study on brain. We're going to touch upon that with people. This is out of McLean Hospital, Dr. Martin Titcher. This is a 10-year-old boy with no history of trauma. And this is a 10-year-old boy kind of with a history of trauma, all lit up. And when my colleague or friend of mine and author of the book, Helping Traumatized Children Learn, asked doctor if he'd get a clearer picture, he said, do you know how hard it is to get a 10-year-old boy with a history of trauma into an MRI? So this is what we get. But again, you can see he's kind of all lit up. To the kids, we want to impress upon this to police officers. Sometimes police officers will go to house and there's domestic violence. We know statistically, at least from the FBI and some other sources, that if there's domestic violence going on in the house, it's probably 15 times more likely there's also child abuse. And if that's the case, then they need to be looking a little bit more than just the incident of the two principals or the mother or father or whatever the situation may be. And again, you can start to see the behavioral risk factors when we talk about this. And again, hyperactivity, you see that, police see it, et cetera. Depression. The one I want to just spend a minute on or half a minute on is perfectionism. We have an awful lot of kids that will get in your face and tell you where to go. And I've spent my career with those kids, and they're pretty good to work with because you kind of have it, they put it right up front. The kids who really, really concern me are those kids who fly below the radar. They've either learned on their own because they're smart, that they don't bring attention to themselves or their family, or they've been chastised into it or strongly encouraged. And again, that idea of you don't bring people to this house, you don't, so, at school, you better be perfect. And so I think a lot of those kids tend to fly under our radar. Again, just other things in terms of mental health risks, and certainly oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder are going to get you before juvenile court. And then also you see the last 2 or 3. One of the first people at schools, when I go to a school and they say, who do you like to talk to? The psychologist, the vice principal. First person I want to talk to, be honest with you, is the nurse, because I think they see a lot of things that we don't all see. And they have a pretty good, if you pardon the pun, pulse on the school. Again, public health risks, we talk about that with ACEs. The effects on learning, again, the piece here is that educators won't know which students are affected by ACEs. So we have to go into the example that most schools are, and that's why I like the TLPI approach, because it talks about everyone understanding what trauma is. And if we see certain behaviors, maybe it's trauma, maybe it's not, but let's not assume that it's just a bad character kid or somebody who's a bad kid. And again, here are the main places that it's certainly going to affect: academic, classroom, relationships, academic performance, those skills, ability to process, verbal, nonverbal, communication, the idea of sequential organization, A to B, B to C, C to D, et cetera, that also cause and effect. And anyone who's worked with this population knows that a lot of these kids have a difficult time also identifying and differentiating some of their emotions. They're not quite sure. Executive functioning gets gets affected, and certainly transitions the beginning of class and the end of class and paying attention, et cetera. And it takes some of these kids between transitions to kind of get into a seat, settle down, et cetera. And as a friend, as Joe Westuccia tells me, he said it would be great if that 8-year-old boy could raise his hand and say, "Excuse me, teacher, I've been a little dysregulated the last 8 minutes. I'm wondering if you can help me get settled." They're not going to do that, and so we see acting out behavior, et cetera. Classroom behavior, again, that perfectionism, withdrawal, defiance. And then relationships. This is a key piece because, again, the lack of trust, everything is about relationships, isn't it? Right? At that early age into teenager, et cetera. Lack of insight, both with adults and their peers. So sometimes these kids can be more apt to be the bully or bullied. And so, again, we want to raise this awareness with folks. Just as something that TLPI talks about, dangers everywhere, must always be vigilant. And the school may say he won't pay attention, he's smart, but he won't try hard enough. If I'm perfect, I'll protect myself and my parent. And she's such a good kid, she doesn't need help. And I've always had to be in control so that I can avoid danger. We see this a lot in our kids, don't we? She's defiant and aggressive, a bad kid. Well, it may be that one place that, as you know, it's safe enough to them to have a little bit of control because they don't at home. And so this is one place they can exert their authority, or so to speak. And they can't trust that you have my best interest at heart, rejects any help that I have to offer. And again, here is just some of the things that adults can do in that system, and they can, again, that idea of misunderstanding traumatic symptoms as character flaws, that idea of, what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. That's what we want to get to, that next piece. And again, to students, it goes everywhere from decreased motivation. Who wants to go to a school and be in last place in terms of academics, or feeling like you're the dummy kid, et cetera, et cetera? You can't do it. Having poor relationships at school. After a while, school would become a place that I think I would avoid as well. And again, you can see, and you know this as well as I do. This is just something one of our judges said to me. We gotta keep kids in, and we can't let them go. And we can't use suspensions and expulsions. I will say that when we started working with Andrea, we took a look at 3 of the schools in one of the cities we were in, pretty good sized schools. And the pre and post, after 2 years of pre and post, there was a 70% decrease in suspendable offenses and a 43% decrease in office referrals. So if I'm selling it to us, and a lot of this is sales, to a superintendent, and they're saying, well, how's it going to help me run my day-to-day? It is going to help you. And again, this is what we're trying to get through to you, et cetera, and to them. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I think it's worth it. And I'm gladly send you these slides. I'll also send you the videos on these. But what I really liked about TLPI is that basically they broke down 4 domains for kids to have success: relationship, self-regulation, academic success, and healthcare. And what I think you can see is that everyone has certain kinds of questions that we may think about with a child. So at the end of the week or next week or whatever, you might have a group that, whether they're the ACEs group or they're the group of kids who have special needs, whatever name it is, but you're looking for high-risk kids and you want to discuss them. This gives everyone in those groups an understanding of why relationships are important and what kinds of questions to ask, why self-regulation is important and what kind of questions to ask. So the gym teacher is asking the same questions as the math teacher, the same questions as the nurse, and getting those answers. And I think this is a really good and effective way, quite frankly, of addressing kids, because it does give us that team approach, that whole school approach, and we have a common language. Again, this idea of breaking out of your domains and starting to think a little bit differently than you normally have done. Again, you can see the red envelope there. Joe is a business, also teaches business management, and small is the new big. And I think that's a nice piece. The daily agenda, these kids they want to know what's going on. What's the next class? And again, sometimes teachers will say, I never put the time, because if I go to 9:15 and I said we're going to be done with math at 9:10, they're going to let me know. So for kids who have anxiety or are always looking, what's next, some kind of agenda is a good thing. The red envelope, we'll talk about that. Kitchen table, give me 5. Those are all techniques which are in the book. Happy to talk about them at some point, but they're all very effective in engaging children. This is from the website, traumasensitive schools.org. All this is free. all the two books you see there, the one on the right, the purple book at top, and then how to put that to creating and advocating child sensitive schools are all free. They can be downloaded PDF. You can put them on your reader, whatever it is. They also have some really good videos, and there's a lot of material, and I'm happy to get that for you or share that with you. And then again, another video that they have. One thing I would bring to your attention, and I'll share one of my last couple slides with you, is this came out in your lower right-hand corner, Children Exposed to Violence, came out from the School of Medicine, the Child Study Center, the International Chiefs of Police, OJJDP, really, really good. You can get it online. We used to have it. They used to have it printed. I think they had 30,000. I think we gave out 1,000 at one point, but you can get it online. And if you ever want the PowerPoints to this, at their permission, I created those PowerPoints, and I'm happy to share those with you. It asks police and other community people, how are you addressing the youth of kids? Again, lastly, before we had this response, it was something happened at the house. The police responded, a 51A or mandated report happened. The police wrote a report. The police leave and the child goes to the school the next day. Andrea will get into this. And this is where we hope to be. And I'm going to let Miss Andrea finish that. My last slide is, we also think it's really important not only for teachers to be trained and really trained, and then also to use SROs and also police officers, patrolmen, and asking them when they get to a scene and there are children there, here's how you can address that. So we spend a couple hours, maybe an hour or so, maybe more, on going through this, maybe even doing some a case study or role playing, etc. But we can't get to it enough. And the other piece is, we're also asking officers, if there are no kids present, are there kids at the house? Do you see toys? Do you see bikes? Do you see something on the refrigerator, etc.? I now have I'm going to share with Miss Andrea Darr, and Andrea, you're just going to say, go ahead, and I'm going to move your slides. Is that all right with you?
That's great with me, but you're a tough act to follow, Ed. I'll try. I'm just going to talk a little bit about, Ed laid out the case for why we had to do something to help these kids. So I'm not going to go there. I'm going to just show you what we created in West Virginia to help our kids based on the problems that we had. If there are people that are attending this that want me to focus on a certain thing, put it in the chat. And Cody, if you don't mind, bring it to my attention and I'll make sure I go there and cover that. But I just want to tell you a little bit about what we did to address this issue. In West Virginia, small state, 1.8 million people, 380,000 kids. Our problems were the drug crisis and poverty. And of course, when you have those two things, you have child abuse, you have domestic violence, you have all the above. But when we looked at our programming, we knew we had to do something that really addressed the drugs and the poverty, because these drugs were making the poverty 10 times worse on the kids. Everything they had in the home for resources was going to drugs. So we created a program called Handle with Care. And our program, the whole focus of our program when we sell it out there, is we want children to learn when they're in the classroom, and children can't physically learn if they're traumatized. So we want children to succeed every day to the very best of their ability. And research tells us this trauma undermines their ability to learn, form relationships, and to function appropriate in the classroom. So when you think of Handle with Care, think of focus, behave appropriately, and learn. Next slide, please. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about where it came from. And Ed and I do have a history where our paths intertwined and really affected each other's programming. But in 2009, there was a big study that found that 60% of children had been exposed to crime, violence, and abuse, and 40% had been direct victims of 2 or more violent acts. That prompted then Attorney General Eric Holder to launch the Defending Childhood Initiative, charging all states with coming up with programming to address this issue. I, at the time, managed a couple of grants that looked at the investigation, prosecution, and resolution of child abuse cases. And so we already had a committee that met quarterly with the judges, law enforcement, social workers, everybody was at the table. So we just created, my friend Tracy at the U.S. Attorney's Office called me and said, hey, let's come up with our own program. We've got to task force. Let's just create a subcommittee and start looking at what everyone else is doing and see what's working. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, but we want to see what's working and what can address our issues here in West Virginia. So we met monthly in 2012. And we looked at programs all over the country, and we found Mr. Leon White in Huntington, West Virginia, told us that he saw Ed in Florida, and he had a program called the Red Envelope Project, and that he really thought it could help our kids because he had identified when kids were on the scene of a police incident. And so we love that notification part of that. But we looked at programs all over. We picked the parts that we liked. We then met with our bosses, our lawyers, the policy people, everybody. They said, well, you can't do this because it might jeopardize victim safety. You can't do this because it might violate confidentiality. You can't do this because it doesn't violate your policy, but it violates my policy. You can't do this because I said you can't do this. You know how it goes. Can't. So they stripped it down to handle with care. That's all that was left, was 3 words. And that turned out to be a blessing. So it worked in our head. We wanted to see if it worked at school. So we piloted it in 2013, realized schools really loved it. Once law enforcement figured out they're going back at that house and Johnny's still going to be there and he's a little hot mess and here's something we can really do to help him. Once people realized if you put it all together, it really helps, it took off. So we moved our programming to the state police because this is sort of first responder led. And so we needed to be in an agency that was statewide that had that. And just a little tip for you guys out there starting this, if you want to start this and you want to go talk to your chief and your sheriff, take an officer with you if you can. So take someone who speaks their language if you can. That's going to help you in the long run. So we have reached out to all 55 of our counties, and when we've also been spreading our program all around the country. Next slide, Ed. You know what the problem is? Trauma affects that child's ability to learn, and students don't learn. You know, you live in chaos at home, you come to school, you're the bad kid, you start getting behind. You can't win for losing, you just kind of drop out. And then, you know, that's the worst thing that could happen. So that's the problem. The next slide. The solution is if law enforcement is present and children are present, those are the children most at risk. And we have got to be able to give them some support and to prop them up. Those are the kids that need it. In the past, all law enforcement had in their toolbox was a mandated report. Most kids don't rise to that level. Consequently, they're never identified. They never get services. That's what we're doing at Handle with Care. Let's identify kids at risk. So now we're just giving law enforcement, fire department, and EMS another tool in their toolbox. Children present, send a notice. And that notice is going to get to the school, and that teacher's going to be able to be proactive instead of reactive. It's so much easier to prevent a meltdown in your classroom than to put that classroom back together. Next slide, please. We can skip this. You've already covered that, Ed. So when you think of Handle with Care, a lot of people think it's a notice. And it is a notice, but it's more than that. We have a model of fidelity on the website, handlewithcarewv.org. It is a notice, but a notice alone is not enough. It's never okay to identify a child and not be prepared to help them. So the notice is the very first part, and we include not only law enforcement, but EMS because of overdoses and the fire department. The second part of our program is what Ed talked about, the helping traumatized children learn. We want schools, and when we say schools, bus drivers, lunch ladies, custodians, everyone the kids talk to learn about trauma, what it does to a developing brain, what it looks like in the classroom, what you can do to mitigate those negative effects, because so those children will feel welcome and they'll feel like they belong, and so that they can learn at school. The third part of our program is mental health providers on site. Parents don't get kids to appointments for a number of reasons. A lot of them are working 2 or 3 jobs to keep the lights on. Some of them live in situations where transportation's an issue. Some of them lives in households where they don't have access to that. Some of them lives in households where the priority for the kids' appointment's not the priority. They're not getting those kids to the appointments. So we're not even going to go there. We just want accessible mental health services for the kids that really need them. The trick is, well, we piloted in Charleston because that's where we live. with the Charleston Police Department and Mary C. Snow Elementary. Why Mary C. Snow? Because that's the busiest law enforcement car in Charleston. We created, if you'll click the button, Ed, we created this handy dandy little form, and it says if you're getting this notice on little Johnny, they've been on the scene of a police incident in the last 24 hours, might exhibit academic, emotion, or behavioral problems. Please handle this child with care. The trick is, click the button, please, Ed. How are you going to get the notice from the law enforcement officer up through the chain of command and over to the school before the start of the next school day? Next slide. Every county does it different. Every district does it different. You can do it however. What you need to do is work with your community and see what works best for them. Ask them, ask your chief and your sheriff to meet with your superintendent, your principals. What's the best way to do it? Is it email? Is it going through 911? Is it texting? Is it an app? Is it a QR code? Whatever it is, all those are fine. It can't be a fax machine because that's sitting in public areas and people will walk by, and it's not everyone's business at the school. It's only the business of the people that work with those children. Next slide, please. When we started the program, we said if children are present and you think they've been traumatized, send the notice. That's the wrong thing to do. It's not our place to judge whether or not a child's been traumatized, is it? What affects one child might not affect another. So now we just say children's present, yes or no. If yes, name, age, and school, period, on every kid. Next slide. We have a roll call video. It's 9 minutes and 41 seconds. This is the old roll call, but if you'll go on the website, handlewithcarewv.org, there's a new roll call video that you can use for law enforcement officers in training. Next slide. Just a couple of things about the notice. Only 3 words, no details are ever given, ever, ever, ever. You're not going to get the details. If we gave you the details, we wouldn't have a program. It would violate all kinds of confidentiality. It needs to arrive before the start of the next school day, but if it doesn't, just get it there as soon as you can. Need to know basis only at the school. Does not stay in a child's permanent record. A handle with care notice is just to alert the school that this child might need some extra support. We include child care serving agencies because the younger that child is, the more lethal that environment is. School internal handle with cares are very beneficial, and it's very important that people understand it doesn't mean you approach the child. Just because you get a notice doesn't mean you pounce on that child first thing in the morning. That's not what that child needs. That child needs to feel safe, needs to feel included, needs their basic needs met. And that's what it's all about. You're a silent observer. Next slide. As Ed said, we believe handle with care will reduce discipline actions, reduce absenteeism, and achievement will go up. More kids will want to come to school. That's our biggest problem, is just getting kids to come to school. So we think if we do this right, they will come to school. They will feel more welcome. Next slide. I know I'm going fast, but I want to have time for questions. Just a couple more. I like this slide a lot because just to remind everybody that the school is sometimes the only safe place in the kids' whole world. It's the only safe place, the only place they get food, the only place they get a caring adult. And it's really easy to turn the school into a combative situation because traditional discipline does not work on the kids. If this, then that. If you don't turn in your homework, you're going to get a 0. Big whoop. Where am I going to sleep tonight? Where am I going to get food for my brothers and sisters at home? You know, that traditional stuff doesn't work on these kids. What they do need is support, predictability, and a safe environment. So that's why we need trauma sensitive schools, the only safe place in these kids' whole world sometimes. Next slide, please. Summary, handle with care identifies the kids most at risk to go into the system. It provides teachers with a heads up so they can be proactive instead of reactive. It connects children with much needed mental health services. We found about 90% of the kids that were handled with care needed to talk to a therapist to to work through it. It strengthens and improves relationships in the community. I had a Handle with Care coordinator tell me people don't realize when you start this program, you're starting all kinds of conversations and connections in the community that you would never have had. And because you have that, it's so much easier to meet the needs of the kids in the community. And overall, it's going to improve academic, social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes for kids. So that's what we're all about. And I think that's going to be my last slide. Is it, Ed? Oops, we're all over the country. One more slide. Here's just a map of places that we know what's happening. Success in school is success in life. That's what it's all about. If you can keep that kid in that day, that week, that month, that year, and get them to graduate, that's the very, very best thing you can do for that child. So that's what Handle with Care is all about. And if we can stop sharing the screen, Ed, we can take questions. If anyone has any questions.
Anything in the chat?
Hello, Renee. How are you?
You're on mute. There you go.
Great. Thank you both, Andrea and Ed. I do have a question. So do all of your police departments that you work with, Andrea, and all the different states, do they all have an MOU with the schools and the police departments?
We ask that they have an MOU, that they work towards that MOU. They need that MOU. We have a sample on the website. It was written by Judge Keys in Troup County, Georgia. We went back and forth and created a really, really good basic template. So it's right there that anyone can use to start that.
Beautiful. Thank you. I do have one other quick question. It mentioned in your timeline with the state police having launched, statewide for West Virginia. Do you know how many other states that you work with? Because I know that you're now taking that new role, which we're very excited about.
It's great.
How many other states started out that way, doing it statewide? I feel like that's like the trickle down effect instead of doing it regionally.
Let me give you an example. Go right now, you're at your computer, go to Handle with Care, Ohio, OH. Once you get to Handle with Care, Ohio, go up on the top right-hand side and you see contact information. And when you pull that down, you'll be amazed by that. Handle with Care Ohio started by a lady that called me, a young lady in a mental health organization, and she was brilliant. She was so smart. I knew she got it, all three parts of the Handle with Care program. So I worked with her and mentored her and helped her. And so she kind of followed our model of having a map or having an outline where people could see where it is and where it wasn't, and where it was, who you could contact in that community to make it happen. But that's Robin Vinoy, and she has done a fabulous job in Ohio. So there are other states that are doing it like that. I mean, she's very methodical. I mean, she was really good at going after that. But there are other states that are trying to do it the same way. People who do Handle with Care, they come from all disciplines, from all agencies. You just got to find the person that gets it, that understands it, and that has it. It really needs to be statewide. It really does. Because, families just move. In fact, we had a success last summer. A Handle with Care was generated in Fort Worth, Texas, and it got over to a school in Virginia within 24 hours. That's how expanded Handle with Care has come, and what a really good infrastructure there is for a lot of people to work within it.
Wow, that's great. Thank you so much.
So we're very excited to take it to another level here at JBS. So very excited to be here. So who at the school? I'm sorry. Sue, you want to know who at this? If only the point person or higher is it? All right, here's our model, okay? Yep. It works if you have one person at the police department copying talking to one contact at the education. So whoever that is. So let's say it's someone who screens the reports at 6 a.m. and gets it over to the point of contact. Maybe it's the superintendent, and that superintendent is charged to get it to the principals. Once it gets to the principal, and I say principal, but a lot of times people have a combination of principal, counselor, school nurse, and social worker, because the principal's busiest time in the morning is what? First thing in the morning. You know, they can't check those emails all the time. So it's just, if once it gets to the school, we want the principal, only the teachers that work with the kids, the school counselor, and the school nurse. We included the school nurse later on because we figured out the universal sign for a little kid that something's wrong with my belly hurts, but it's not their belly. It's, you know, they need some support. So it's not everyone's business. When I go train, I go right in schools and say, it's not everyone's business in this school. It's only the business of the people that work with the kids.
Mhm.
Did that answer that, Sue? Yes.
Good.
Carlos, you were going to say something?
No, I was just gonna read the question for you, but looks like you saw it, so I'll stay out of the way.
Andrea, I have a question for you. Can you tell us how many states have tried to put it into, made it statewide legislatively or otherwise?
That's a hard question. A lot of people want to put it in legislation or put it in policy. And when I brought that up in my state, they said, do you want buy-in from law enforcement or do you want to hammer it? You know, there's two different ways to make things happen. How do you want to go about doing it? You really need to know the temperament and pulse in your legislature and you know, who you can count on. And you just need to gauge it. I don't know how to say it other than that. Nevada passed a law making it a law. They have to send handle with care notices. And I think they got a little bit of a backlash because they didn't include a lot of people in that discussion. The Attorney General in New Jersey put it in protocol for law enforcement to do that. You know, I can't give you a good answer because you're going to have to do it state by state. And it's going to have to be based on the temperament in your state. Don't you think, Ed?
No, I do. I think that's true in communities too, the statewide level, also in those communities. In some communities, it's the chief of police who's like all about it. And in other communities, it's, you know, it's the superintendent or somebody else or et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, exactly. You're always looking for that champion.
And you'll find it. You'll find it. They always surface no matter where you are. We have a volunteer coordinator in each of our 55 counties in West Virginia, and it's just the person that bubbled up at the stakeholder meeting who saw how important it was and was able to bring the powers that be to the table and just to ride herd on it to make sure it happened. There's a lot of training on our website for the new people on this call, handlewithcarewv.org. Roll call videos. We just have a new Handle with Care Trauma Academy, virtual academy. There are 12 15-minute videos in a learning management system. We did it 15 minutes at a time because teachers don't have an hour, but they got 15 minutes here and there. So it's all for school staff, you know, everyone at school, not just the teachers. So there's plenty of training.
And if you have any questions, you can get a hold of us. I think our contact info is in there somewhere. We're happy to do that. I don't want to speak for Andrea, but she's been more than willing over the last 13 years to help anybody. So great.
Any other questions, folks?
I just put my email and cell phone in the chat. Feel free to call. If I'm not zooming, I'll answer it. Sue, you've been on a lot of our calls before, haven't you? Yeah, we've done some work there. I forget your county. What's your county?
Worcester County in Massachusetts.
Yes. Yes, Renee.
If I could also just add the base camp that you've started, nationally has been amazing. You spoke to being able to find that MOU, and I know there's like folders for each of the states, and I just want to share how helpful that's been to network and be able to kind of utilize other people's, where they've already kind of territory that they've already secured, if you will. So that's been super helpful. Thank you.
So for anyone that's interested, we have monthly Zoom meetings with Hand with Care contacts all over the country. So just email me and we'll get you invited to that. And along with that, we have a base camp, and it's a, what is it? Cody, help me explain what a base camp is. You join base camp and there's all these resources. Everybody puts in, every state has a folder, and you can put in there the flyers you're using, videos that you've created, legislation that you've passed. It's just a way to share resources so we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Renee, can I ask you a quick question? You've actually kind of expanded, maybe some other folks, but can you just briefly talk about taking Handle with Care into the emergency room? I think that's amazing. So can you just give it a quick overview on that? Do you mind?
Sure. So it recently was implemented March of this year, and the idea in talking with administration for the 2 emergency departments that we work with was, how can we identify youth and be able to bring that trauma-informed care responsiveness to the youth after they've had an ED visit, emergency department visit, to school the next day, to have that same, Handle with Care given. And so it was decided that it would be built out in phases. And so this first phase is strictly a self-referral tool that the parent or caregiver is given if they would like. They don't have to take the form. If they're registering their child 3 years old to 18 years old in the emergency room. So they're not defining what a trauma might be. The premise is that just being in the emergency room is a trauma in of itself. And so that form is given to the caregiver. They determine if they want to turn that into the school, daycare, or primary care physician. And then information is listed with our website for Haywood's Handle with Care. And it has lots of information on there if they're not affiliated with Handle with Care at this time. And it's just another layer of providing trauma responsive care. Yeah,
I think it's brilliant. I mean, we look at that kind of taking that sequential intercept model of where can we have effective, make effective change or positive. And certainly the emergency room is one of those places. I mentioned it even in my story where those kids all went to the emergency room and then came back home. So again, I really like that, thinking outside the box and thinking, who else can we get on in our team to be kind of the eyes and ears for these kids?
Yes,
thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
When you're trying to figure out who can send a Handle with Care notice, the best thing to do is to look at the policy of whoever licenses you to do what you do.
Right.
For instance, a CPS worker cannot send a Handle with Care notice because that in our state, it violates statute here.
Right.
For doing that, but law enforcement can. So you just got to look at whoever licenses you for what you do, and that's the best place to figure out if your agency can send a Handle with Care notice.
So Andrea, there was a question in the chat there. I'm not sure. We're just about out of time, and I want to be respectful of that. If folks are able to stick around for the answer, we're happy to continue, but wanted to see if you had a chance to see that question there in the chat.
South Dakota. So you're Attorney General in South Dakota. Darcy, where is Darcy?
Here.
Hey, Darcy. Do you know Sarah Ketwig?
Yes. Yeah, I've been working with her. And in fact, we had our meeting, our statewide meeting this morning, a Zoom meeting. And she doesn't have an answer either. We have a state's attorney in each county, and it's one of the counties I'm working with is kind of the roadblock at this point. All of our trainings are done. Stakeholder meetings are done. Schools bought in, fire departments bought in, but law enforcement won't because the state's attorney is saying it violates Marcy's law.
So state attorney for the whole state or just in your county?
Just in our county.
Okay, that opens that up. One thing that you can do is get the ones in the surrounding counties to do it, and then they'll all, like, we can do it. We don't understand what the problem is. That's one way of attacking that.
Yep.
When we started it, we had the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of West Virginia helping us start this and opening the doors, the highest law enforcement officer in our area. And we ran it by everybody for a year. I'm telling you, they grilled us for a year. It looked much different in the beginning, but literally if you have a police blotter in your newspaper, the law enforcement officer was at this address on this day for a domestic. They just gave you so much more information than you'd ever get from Handle with Care notice. You're going to get nothing. The police are giving you more than the Handle with Care will give you, because you get nothing. It could be a murder. It could be a search warrant. You have no idea. And that is not your business. Your business is helping that child learn and addressing the trauma. Yeah. That's what I just keep telling them.
Mm-hmm. And Andrea, I'm sure you had them. We've had number ones where Grammy, who's been living in the in-law apartment downstairs, naturally aspires, has a heart attack, but the kids were there present. She's been there 13 years. It's not a violent situation, but it's a death, and it's certainly traumatic for those kids. So those kinds of things are also included we also included those with Handle with Care. If you think it could affect the child, then, as you say, make the report, right? Just say Handle with Care.
Children present, yes or no. If yes, name, age, school, period.
Yep. Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Tell Miss Sarah I said hi.
I will do that.
Ed and Andrea, thank you so much for today's session. We are out of time, and so we want to be mindful and respectful of that. And for folks who joined, thank you so much for your engagement and for your questions. If you have additional questions, feel free to send them on to the OVC TTA email or to Andrea and Ed, as they provided their contact information. I've included a link to the survey for this session, so we welcome all feedback just to help us improve our sessions and continue to make positive changes. Again, Andrea and Ed, thank you so much for today's session. Very informative, and looking forward to discussing this further with other grantees as well, and folks who may request TA or support. So with that, we'll close today's session, and hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.